So good evening, everyone, and welcome to the London School of Economics, those in the room and online. My name is Silvana Tanreiro. I'm a professor of economics here at the LSE, and I'm delighted to welcome Professor Elhanan Helpman, who will give the Atkinson lecture today. Elhanan Helpman is the Galen L Professor of International Trade at Harvard University and the president of the International Economic Association. He made groundbreaking contributions on three areas of economics: international economics, economic growth, and political economy. His innovative theories in all three areas are motivated by and grounded on evidence, and they're formalized in hugely insightful models. Elhanan is the founder of the new international trade theory, along with Paul Krugman. This is a theory of trade with imperfect competition in differentiated products, a fundamental departure from the old theory that relied almost exclusively on comparative advantage and struggled to speak to the facts. His work has expanded into studies of multinationals and the role of market powers and firms and industrial organization in international trade. His latest work in the field has put the lens on the consequences of international trade and more broadly globalization, and in particular the link with inequality, which is part of a very live policy debate today. His work with Jean Grossman on economic growth was equally groundbreaking, elucidating how companies' investments in new products and production techniques could also contribute to general knowledge and facilitate innovations by other companies. And his seminal work on political economy has taught us, amongst many other things, how the influence of powerful lobbying groups on politicians can shape international trade patterns. One of the most prolific scholars in economics, Elhanan has published 18 books and 150 articles in leading international journals, all while also doing an enormous amount of public service for the profession. He has received multiple awards, including the Onassis Prize, the Frontiers of Knowledge Award, the Jean-Jacques Lafon Prize, and the Israel Prize. And he's also the most wonderful teacher, as I was very lucky to experience his teaching back in the days. Turning to the lecture, Professor Elhanan Helpman will talk about the future of foreign trade. This is, as we all know, a very topical theme today. Before we get there, I will ask you to just put your cell phones on silent, and that's it for me. Please join me in welcoming Elhanan.
Very much, Silvana, and thank all of you for coming to this presentation. I want to start by saying that I am greatly honored to give the Atkinson lecture. I don't know how many of you knew him, but I did. And Tony was a great scholar and a wonderful person. He was very kind to graduate students and to young scholars more generally. And he spent his career, or most of it, studying inequality long before Thomas Piketty popularized it a few years ago. So I'm very honored to give this lecture. And now to my lecture. So foreign trade has expanded rapidly since the beginning of the 19th century. And this clicker doesn't work. Again.
I see it's turned on here. .
No, I have my own.
Clicking on
Click on the keyboard.
keyboard.
Do you want to put this in?
There's a little way down in here. Oh, here.
Okay, so
Here, try putting it here.
You need to just click on the PDF. Yes, click that with the mouse.
Click on the- Take them out.
Because sometimes it's switching.
No.
Yeah. And now try with the series of clicking. Yeah.
Okay.
There we are.
Oh, well.
Thank you. Okay, so as I tried to say, foreign trade has expanded rapidly since the beginning of the 19th century, as you can see in this graph, and it played a vital role in economic development around the world at that time. And particularly, as you can see in this graph, global merchandise exports, which accounted for about 5% of GDP at the beginning of the 19th century, reached 25% in the 21st century. However, this expansion was not uniform, and you can see that it declined in between the wars, and then it accelerated after World War II. Trade in manufactured goods played a particularly important role during this expansion, which was very important for the growth of many countries during the 19th century, until the collapse of trade between the two wars, starting with World War I and then between the two wars. And as you can see here, merchandise exports reached about $25 trillion in 2022. And this was a little bit less than the size of the US economy, to give you some notion of how large this was. And importantly, trade in services, which was almost negligible, I would say, in the 1980s, reached $7 trillion in the same year. And in fact, trade in services has been one of the fastest growing components of international trade. And China, the United States, Germany, and Japan are the biggest traders in the world. So globalization in the form of foreign trade was also an important enabler of economic growth, through the fact that technological advancements required large-scale markets and integration into many more countries into the world system enabled implementation of this type of technologies. So market integration provided scale that was required for this, and it fostered innovation and productivity growth. After World War II, countries that expanded foreign trade also grew faster, as you can see in this presentation. There has been a very strong correlation, not necessarily causation, but correlation between expansion into international markets and economic growth. Now, global income inequality increased over time until the beginning of the 1990s, as you can see in this graph. However, since the 1990s, global inequality has declined. And it's important to note that the rise in inequality, and similarly, also to a lesser extent, the decline after the 1990s, was driven by rising inequality across countries. So the way to think about it is that global inequality in which you count every individual as one individual, can be decomposed into inequality across countries and inequality within countries. So the dark bars represent the component of inequality across countries, and the yellow bars represent the component of inequality within countries. And so you see the rising inequality was driven primarily by the rising inequality across countries, and then during the decline, it was similarly. Now, economic inequality of this type decline, especially because many poorer countries grew fast after 1990. And they closed the gap in income per capita with the richer countries during this period. At the same time, starting in the late 1970s, economic inequality within countries, particularly wealthy countries, but not only wealthy countries, began to rise. And this trend led many to attribute rising inequality to globalization. However, the evidence on this is actually very different. In other words, it does not support the view that globalization was the major driver of inequality within countries. And I've written a book on this. Most people don't want to read the evidence in this book because they want to think that inequality has risen as a result of globalization. So there has been some effect of trade on inequality within countries, but it's raised inequality in a rather minor manner compared to the total rise in inequality within countries. Now, concerns about inequality remain widespread until this very day, and particularly regarding the world's poorest population. The World Bank measures extreme poverty, which is defined as people who live on $1 a day in 1990 prices. And this has been adjusted to $2.15 a day in 2017 prices. So if you look at the red graph, what it shows you is the decline in the fraction of people in the world economy who live in this type of extreme poverty. And what you see there is that it has declined from about 50%, namely half of the population lived in this extreme poverty in the early 1980s. And this has declined to about 10% more recently. So there was a massive reduction in extreme poverty. And the question, of course, is where did this reduction come from? And I want to argue that it's hard to believe that this could have happened without the poorer countries being integrated into the world trading system. I cannot prove it, but it's very hard to believe that this would have been possible otherwise. Now, the establishment of international institutions after World War II, in particularly the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, the GATT, they played a key role in promoting this type of integration that allowed poor countries to grow faster. It was quite important. And so through multiple rounds of trade negotiations, the GATT significantly reduced tariffs and also other impediments and obstacles to trade. And this culminated in what we call the Uruguay round, which was the last successful round of trade negotiations that led to the establishment of the WTO in 1995. Now, if you look at US data, what you see is this rapid decline in average tariffs starting essentially immediately after World War II. And in the US, today, average tariffs are way below 5%, which is quite low. And it's quite similar, actually, in European countries. So here's where we are now. An important development with the formation of the WTO was that they established what is known as the dispute settlement mechanism. And this mechanism is like a court in some sense. And it enforces compliance with what we call the most favored nation tariffs. Now, why is this important? Because the WTO rules are that if you are a member of the WTO, you have to offer every other member the lowest tariff rate that you have. And this is the most favored nation clause tariff, essentially. Typically, most countries impose tariffs which are somewhat below this ceiling, but this is the ceiling. Now, tariffs declined, and as a result, they were increasingly replaced by what we call non-tariff barriers. So this can be anti-dumping legislation or countervailing duties. And in recent years, and this is a sad story for the international economy, the dispute settlement mechanism has essentially crumbled. It started crumbling during the I don't remember exactly which will be the right year, but sometimes in the late Obama administration, and then during the Trump administration, and it just continued during the Biden administration. Now, the formation of the WTO also marked the end of major trade negotiations. So they started a new round called the Doha round, but so far it has gone nowhere, and there haven't been any changes. But as an alternative, what happened was that many countries started to sign free trade agreements. And you can see in this graph the number of free trade agreements that have been signed. Most of them were implemented, but some of them were not implemented. And the cumulative notification of RTAs in force to the WTO, as you can see, reached about 600, and 373 were implemented. And this rapid rise was because our countries had tied hands as far as their trade policies are concerned under the WTO rules. Now, there's a question of whether these agreements improve economic efficiency and facilitate future reductions in trade obstacles or barriers. And this issue has not been settled. There is a debate about this issue in policy circles. And more recently, there isn't much academic work on this, although in the more distant past, there was plenty of work. So while a backlash against globalization has gained traction in public discourse, I want to argue that, unfortunately, many misconceptions persist on this particular issues. One important point often overlooked is that while support for international economic relations has declined somewhat in recent years, it actually remains widespread, contrary to the impression that you might get from reading newspapers. So just give you a few examples. In a Gallup survey, people were asked, and I quote, "What do you think foreign trade means for America? Do you see foreign trade more as an opportunity for economic growth through increased US exports, or a threat to the economy from foreign imports?" I'm reading the question because it's actually quite important how these questions are posed in these surveys. So answering these questions, in 1992, 44% of respondents thought that foreign trade is a growth opportunity for the US. And this has increased to 66% in 2021. So it actually increased. There was a bigger increase a year before. It went up to 79%, and then it declined to 66%. But even 66%, it's not just a majority. It's on issues like this, it's a very large number. And similarly, in a survey conducted in 2023 by the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, they found that 74% of Americans believed international trade benefited the US economy. However, and this is, I find very interesting, 66% also agreed to the following statement. US trade policy should have restrictions on imported foreign goods to protect American jobs. So there is some conflict and tension here between what people want. They want on the one side trade, on the other side they want to restrict trade to protect jobs. And jobs indeed loom very large in the public discourse on these issues. So the last example I want to discuss is a large-scale survey conducted by Stephanie Stancheva, one of my colleagues at Harvard, who also found support for liberal trade policies, also at a decreasing rate over time. So she found 69% in favor in 2019, and this declined to 57% in 2023. But again, 57% is more than half, and on issues like this is considered a pretty large number. She actually gave the course lecture here at the LSE a few years ago, and her conclusion is presented in this quotation here. So I'm going to read it for you. Support for open trade policies is primarily driven by the perception of efficiency benefits. People who believe trade enhances economic efficiency are more likely to favor reducing trade barriers and increasing openness. However, and this qualification is important, those concerned about distributional impacts of trade are not necessarily opposed to trade. Instead, they support policies that redistribute trade gains to mitigate negative effects on vulnerable groups. So again, we see this tension, and many people have a view that there is here a trade-off. And obviously what it means that society and the polity have to find a balance between these considerations. I don't want to talk all the time about the US, but in US, the big problem has been that there is a federal program of trade adjustment assistance, which can solve many problems, but Congress has left it without funds, basically. They haven't adjusted the funds to inflation, to population growth and all that. So it's a very small program, has very little money. They do what they can, and I don't know whether this program will survive the current administration, actually. So a major factor behind the decline in support for open trade policy was the COVID-19 pandemic. So I want to talk a little bit about the consequences of what happened then. So it triggered, as we actually know, it triggered a shift. The pandemic triggered a shift in demand away from services such as entertainment and travel towards goods, towards physical products. And what this did was that as a result, international shipping became overloaded and production of goods struggled to keep pace with demand. And this led to widespread shortages. Unfortunately, this phenomena was interpreted as poor performance of what we call global value chains, essentially global supply chains. I don't know why global value chains has become the formal definition. I think the World Bank basically pushed this term. So the importance of global value chains in foreign trade has in fact increased over time. And I show you here what happened over time. It increased to about half of total trade. So there are different measures, and this measure comes from the World Bank, and the way it's defined is the following. So think about a seat produced in Turkey, a car seat produced in Turkey. This car seat is then exported to the US. If the car seat is installed in a car in the US and the car is sold in the US, it doesn't show up here. But if the same car is exported to the UK, then the value of the car will show up here. Basically, the definition is that you look for components that cross international borders at least twice. It can be 2 times, 3 times, any number higher than this. So this is what this measures. And by this measure, the share of trade along supply chains has reached about half of trade. So they obviously have become very important. Now, more important is the fact that about 2/3 of trade consists of intermediate inputs. So you always think that people trade shirts and shoes and things like this. But in fact, 2/3 of trade is components that are used for production in different products. And the shortages experienced during and after the pandemic were widely seen as the failure of these supply chains, reinforcing, in fact, the negative perceptions of dependence on countries for essential products. However, the pandemic-driven decline in international trade was rather brief. It was somewhat longer during the financial crisis of 2008, and in both cases, trade recovered rather quickly. So despite severe global economic shocks, these were 2 pretty large shocks, and then what I find strange is that contrary to popular belief, I would argue, supply chains actually proved to be remarkably resilient. The recovery was very speedy. Now, one issue which is relevant for the current debate is the observation that these supply chains have grown increasingly complex. And they involve numerous partners across different countries. And the number of partners is actually pretty staggering. So here is some data to show you what I'm talking about. So if you look at, for example, General Motors, I'm not going to go about and discuss every company in this graph, but think about General Motors is sort of interesting. What you see here is General Motors has more than 800 what we call first-tier suppliers. So these are suppliers who sell directly to General Motors. But they have more than 18,000 second-tier, third-tier, fourth-tier, and so on suppliers, which means suppliers of the first-tier suppliers. And the suppliers of the first-tier suppliers have also their own suppliers, and so on. And this accumulates to more than 18,000 suppliers. If you look at Airbus, Airbus has approximately 1,600 first-tier suppliers and more than 12,000 higher-tier suppliers. And it's a sort of interesting to look at these numbers. So you can do it in your spare time, I guess. Now, the important thing is that many countries were integrated into these complex supply chains with many buyers, sellers, and intermediate products that are traded. So here is a sort of map of the type of integration. So the dark blue shows you essentially North America and Europe, and they are their activities in the supply chains are what the World Bank defines as innovative activities. But Asia, for example, plays a very significant role also in the supply chains. And this is a somewhat lighter blue here. And this is what they call in advanced manufacturing. And then you have some countries in Asia and in South America, and they are engaged in limited manufacturing. But many of these countries got integrated into the world system through these complex and very long, essentially, supply chains. Now, in a fair number of low-income countries, increased participation in supply chains contributed to rising income. So if you look at countries that integrated at a high speed into these supply chains, they are also countries with relatively fast growth. So this is a list of a number of countries. So for Mexico, trade along supply chains grew at a pace of about 3% annually between 2010 and 2020. And for Cambodia, it's 11% grows annually. And for Vietnam, which is one of the miracle countries of these years, their integration into these chains developed at a pace of over 13% per annum. Really very, very high speed. We'll come back to Vietnam in another context. But these countries managed to grow and raise income per capita partly through integration at different locations, so to speak, in these long supply chains. So these long supply chains are very important. Now, major supply chain disruptions did occur. And things with which we are very, very familiar, and they are often mentioned, is, for example, the powerful earthquake in Japan in 2011. And there were floods in Thailand, very severe floods in the same year. And they dealt a very heavy blow to car manufacturing in Japan because they were big suppliers of parts to the Japanese car industry. And during the COVID pandemic, semiconductor shortages developed, and they lasted for several years. And of course, there were these sort of shortages of essential products during the pandemic, like masks, toilet paper, shipping containers. Who thought that toilet paper would become an issue? But it was at the time. So one important point that I would like to make at this time is the following. While these events called attention to vulnerability in supply chains, obviously, they masked, importantly, the fact that business firms have constantly to deal with supply chain risk. So these are sort of big events, but on a daily basis, there are many smaller events, and business firms have to deal with them. So they do develop strategies to accommodate these risks and deal with them. So here is some evidence on this based on a survey. So according to the McKinsey Global Institute, who conducted this survey, companies experience supply chain disruptions of varying duration. On average, they face 1 to 2 weeks of disruption every 2 years, 2 to 4 weeks every 3 years, and so on, and disruptions that last more than 2 months, on average every 5 years. So this is very serious stuff, which means that companies are aware that there are disruptions. And in fact, if you read this type of literature, you'll see that they develop strategies to deal with these issues. Now, these disruptions are very costly. So this provides some measure of these costs. So in the aerospace sector, the average cost of this type of disruptions over a 10-year period amounts to about 67% of net annual earnings. It's a pretty large number. And if you go down in the pharmaceutical sector, which in this list has the lowest cost of disruption, it's still 24% of net annual earnings. And if you calculate the average is about 42% of net annual earnings. So these disruptions are pretty often from what we saw before, and they are highly costly, and therefore it's not surprising that the companies engage in strategies to deal with these issues. Now, China's economic growth and increasing participation in international trade have raised very widespread anxiety, well, particularly in the US, I would say. In other countries too, to some extent, but very much so in the US. And since joining the World Trade Organization in 2001, China has expanded very rapidly its exports. And in fact, in 2009, it became the largest exporter in the world. Namely, it surpassed the US in the volume of exports. Now, if you look at trade between China and the US, then it has grown, but Chinese export to the US have risen more than American export to China. So the blue bars are the Chinese export to the US, the red ones are American export to China, and the graph in the negative is basically the trade deficit between the two countries. So you can see that the trade deficit grew, and this gap is what's reflecting the differential growth. Now, this imbalance really bothered many policymakers in the US. But the US also had a trade deficit, an overall trade deficit, not just with China. But for some reason, the focus was on the trade deficit, the bilateral trade deficit with China. Now, despite these growing concerns, estimates of gains from trade tell a very interesting story. And here we have a set of estimates derived from a quantitative general equilibrium model of the world economy. So what you see here is that 17% of US gains from trade between 1995 and 2011 are derived from its trading with China. So this is a pretty significant number. On the other hand, China's gains from trade derive only about 10% from its trade with the US. So here's also an imbalance, but in the opposite direction that one would think about. And the gains from trade are significant. It's about 3.4% for the US and about 4.6% for China. So the point I'm trying to make is that there are gains from trade emanating from the trade between the US and China, and they are actually distributed in favor of the US. But yes, there is also a trade deficit between the two countries from the point of view of the US. Now, nevertheless, despite this evidence, in 2018, President Trump, who was very much concerned with the US trade deficit, the overall deficit, and especially the trade deficit with China, imposed tariffs on imports from China, making a very significant shift in US trade policy. So a particular point I want to emphasize here is the following, that the typical situation was that countries imposed higher tariffs on trade in final goods than on trade in intermediate inputs. Where did this come from? If you go back to history, then in the 1960s, there were many countries who imposed very high, in South America, in Australia, they imposed higher tariffs on intermediate goods than on final goods. And there was a lot of work that economies did trying to measure what was known as the effective rate of protection. And what happens is if you impose higher tariffs on intermediate goods, then this raises very significantly the effective rate of protection. So there was a shift in policy towards lower tariffs on intermediate inputs and higher tariffs on final goods. So this was the situation. But in 2018, there was a shift in policy. So for example, the MFN tariff of the G20 countries had a structure whereby tariffs on final goods were about 3/4 higher than on intermediate inputs. And in the US, they were about 4 times as high. So there were significantly lower tariffs on trade in intermediate inputs. And this changed in 2018 with the imposition of tariffs on China. And you can see it in this graph. The red one shows the tariffs on final goods. The blue one, tariffs on intermediate inputs. So both types of tariffs rose sharply, but tariffs on intermediate inputs rose faster, and they became bigger, essentially, than tariffs on final goods. Now, what were the consequences? So the US trade policy led to a shift of trade away from China to other low-cost Asian countries. So here is a measure where the other low-cost Asian countries consist of about 13 countries to which most of the imports shifted. So you see this dramatic fall in imports from China, which is the dark graph, and a dramatic rise of imports from the other Asian countries, the low-cost other Asian countries. Now, what is this shift? What did it do? Well, it actually increased the overall cost for the US of imports because it became cheaper to import from Asia because these products were not taxed at the border. But the cost in these countries was actually bigger than it was in China, excluding the tariff. So the tariff brought about this shift and raised overall cost. Now, studies of this episode found that Trump's tariffs were fully passed through to higher prices in the US, contrary to the administration's argument. This is pretty amazing that it was completely passed through. Usually, it's only some fraction gets passed through, but in this case, all of it was. And moreover, while US reliance on direct imports from China declined, the indirect dependence grew, because what happened was that these countries, the Asian countries, in order to produce the products that they exported to the US, they bought intermediate inputs in China. So if you accounted for direct plus indirect dependence, the difference wasn't that big. And China actually remained largely intact as a supplier for the US. I'm talking, yes, not speaking of other countries, accounting for the direct and indirect trade. Now, this is a sort of, I think for students, this is very important. It's a beautiful example of how a trade policy has unintended consequences, because nobody sat down to think through what will happen if you pursue a policy of this type. Now, another misconception was that tariff on Chinese imports would reduce the US trade deficit. I'm talking about the overall trade deficit. And we know from macroeconomics that the overall trade deficit depends mostly on savings and investment, and therefore, expectedly, these tariffs didn't do very much to the overall trade deficit. Now, as I pointed out already, the 2020 pandemic led to a surge in negative sentiments towards global supply chain. And it prompted a push toward what's now known as reshoring, nearshoring, and friendshoring policies. Unfortunately, these policies were misguided because they were based neither on clear theoretical considerations nor any solid empirical evidence. And this is sort of quite unfortunate. I'm sort of running out from time, so I'm going to skip some things. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the Biden administration's policies. So the incoming Biden administration opted to maintain Trump's tariffs. They didn't remove them. And moreover, they imposed additional restrictions of all sorts. In fact, shortly after taking office, President Biden issued what's called an executive order, and you see it here, and established a task force that was tasked with developing strategies for strengthening the resilience of American supply chains. And I sort of emphasized the last sentence here in section 1 of this order. Resilient American supply chains will revitalize and rebuild domestic manufacturing capacity, maintain America's competitive edge in research and development, and create well-paying jobs. All wonderful things, except that there's no clear strategy how to achieve them. And the policies that came after that, at least for economists like myself, couldn't achieve this. I find this very disappointing, I must say, because over time, these policies were further elaborated by Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, who is a very distinguished economist, and she taught me macroeconomics when we both were much younger. And nevertheless, this is what she did. So in a speech that she delivered in April 2023, she made this set of statements, which basically are about industrial policy to strengthen supply chains. But as I want to argue, and I don't have time now to go into detail, they are not particularly appealing, and I don't think that they achieved much. She introduced an important term called friendshoring, meaning to try to move manufacturing to friendly countries. And President Macron was interviewed by the economists after these policies were announced, and he was very critical. And the important thing is that Macron called for Europe to respond in the form of industrial policy. So this sort of pushes the world into competitive industrial policies and trade policies, which we know from previous episodes are very dangerous. At least this is what I think. Now, national security-related trade concerns became increasingly widespread during that time. And you can see that it wasn't only a US thing, it was more generally. And if you look at how many times security-related trade concerns were raised in WTO committees, you see this shift, and with a very high number in 2002, for which we have this data. Now, at the same time, as I mentioned before, the US was very concerned with employment in manufacturing. Now, what has happened in the US, if you look, is that manufacturing employment has been on the decline for many years, for about 40 years, actually. And I would argue that based on the evidence, the contribution of trade to this decline has been rather modest. And you have here the graph of total employment, and as a fraction of total employment, it's now below 10%. So this thing has sort of stabilized after the financial crisis. Nevertheless, this issue has remained central to debates of trade and industrial policy. Now, importantly, trade restrictions began to increase following the 2008 financial crisis. So this is important, and you can see it here. Now, these restrictions were primarily concerned in goods trade, which are the green bars, but they also spilled over into trade and services, which are the yellow bar. And you see the rapid rise. These numbers come from the WTO. You see the rapid rise in the number of trade restrictions after the pandemic. So it was a broader phenomenon, not just a US phenomenon. The other thing which is sort of interesting, that if you look at terms such as reshoring, onshoring, or nearshoring, they've become very prominent in corporate presentations. And here you have the number of times these terms are mentioned in corporate presentation. And again, you see this rapid rise. And there's some distribution of how often the different terms are mentioned, but they are substantial. So again, it was a sort of broad phenomenon. Another issue that became prominent concerns geopolitical considerations. And this has become influential in shaping trade relations. And it elevated the importance of alliances across countries. So for example, countries with more treaties, particularly economic ones, tend to trade more with each other. And participation in regional trade agreements leads countries to vote very similarly in the UN General Assembly. There's a very high correlation between the two. And if you look at the two emerging blocs, one around the US and the other around China, there was a decline in trade across the blocks. This is the graph in the right panel as compared to within the block. And in this paper, the author sort of draw an analogy with the Cold War, which you see on the left panel, the red graph. You see the decline in trade between the bloc during and after World War II, then it's relatively flat. And when the Soviet Union collapses, you see the increase. Now, I'm not entirely happy with this analogy because what happened was that the Soviet bloc was not integrated in the world trading system. They had a regional trade agreement, which was called Comecon, and this was trade among the countries that belonged to the Soviet bloc, and they traded very little with other countries. So shocks across the blocks didn't have much of an effect. But today, the situation is different because the countries around China, they are very heavily integrated into the world trading system. So I think the consequences are much more difficult. Now, tariffs imposed on goods within global supply chains, as I've already mentioned, but I want to mention again, they can have very substantial consequences. So in some of the work that I did with Gene Grossman and Steve Redding, we estimated that the cost of Trump's tariff was approximately $24 billion. Now, whether you think it's a big number or a small number, it's beside the main point I want to make now. We can debate it, but... And the point I want to make now is that if you compare this estimate that took into account the fact that trade follows supply chains, and therefore, if there is a disturbance, companies have to go and look for new suppliers in different countries, this element raises substantially the cost. And this estimate is about 3 times as high as estimates that just use Harbergian triangles, which is the sort of typical thing to do. So this is the main point I wanted to make here. The other point I want to make is we have here Francesco and Silvana. So they wrote a paper some years ago in which they examined the relationship between trade openness and income volatility. And they found that while openness can sort of heighten volatility, but by encouraging specialization, this is the sort of main mechanism, what it does is it shields you from domestic shocks. And what they found in a quantitative analysis is that international trade has in fact reduced economic volatility for most of the countries that they consider. So trade is also important for reducing volatility, at least of this type. And as shown earlier, companies routinely face significant disruption risk in the normal cost of business. And then to design public policies to deal with these risks, you have to account for the fact that the companies do it already. So the big question you have to answer is, are private risk management strategies insufficient? Okay. From a social point of view, do firms invest too little or maybe too much in this type of strategies to mitigate this type of risk? If you don't ask these questions, you will get the wrong answer for sure. So in some work that I did also with Gene and one of the Princeton students, we actually studied this question, and we found that there are many instances in which companies, we found in a theoretical analysis, companies can overinvest in mitigating this type of risks. And there are also some cases in which the opposite is true. The most interesting thing for practical issues is that this can vary across sectors. And one important element that we identify is that the demand elasticity of a sector plays a big role, whether companies over-invest or under-invest. So I wanted to talk about this graph, but because I'm sort of out of time, I'm going to skip it. This is just a simulated set of simulated examples that illustrate this point. So the cost of trade fragmentation varies across estimates. And so I've put up here a graph with a set of estimates of the fragmentation. So what are the main lessons coming out of here? So estimates of the cost of trade fragmentation range from about 0.2% to 7% of GDP. And importantly, these losses rise to an upper bound of 8.5% when accounting for sectoral misallocation and reduction in knowledge diffusion. Knowledge diffusion is very important for productivity growth. And international trade is a very important mechanism through which knowledge diffuses across countries. And so if you add also technological decoupling, not just trade decoupling, you can go up to a loss of about 12%. So again, I'm not sure that these numbers are accurate, but if you think that they give you some notion of what's involved, you have to conclude that we have to be very careful with decoupling attempts, and essentially we should try to move away from this type of fragmentations. So what these figures suggest to me is that there are, at least potentially, enormous economic costs of decoupling. So the last point I want to make, I see Silvana is looking at me. The largest is the following, that the largest potential losers from a massive breakup of international supply chains, which are the sort of main mechanisms through which countries trade now, are unfortunately low middle income countries. So what you see in this graph is that the share of wealthy countries has declined in trade, has declined from 72% to about 57%. But these green bars show you what happened to these countries. Namely, we are talking really about countries whose income per capita is between $1,000 in last year's prices to about $4,500. So they are really poor countries, and they were the biggest gainers in trade along supply chains. So obviously what's going to happen, and this all happens in the 21st century, the data is from 2001 to 2021, that segmentation of production, decoupling and all that is going to hurt these poor countries with an income per capita between $1,000 and about $4,500. So let me conclude. I think that the global economy faces substantial risks from the erosion of the current rule-based international orders. Many people say it, but you know, if many people say it, it doesn't mean that it's wrong. It can be true. And I think in this case it is. So uncoordinated industrial and trade policies coupled with increasing geopolitical fragmentation into clubs, this is very dangerous, and it poses a real threat to global trade and investment. And although global value chains may not always operate at peak efficiency, most things don't, they have demonstrated notable resilience and performance in recent years. And if we want to fix them, we better think carefully how to fix them in order to achieve something positive. Because business has already factored supply chains, risks into their strategies, and it remains uncertain how government intervention can improve on it. Potentially, yes, but we have to study it carefully rather than sort of make statements, impose policies which don't have very little basis. And foreign trade has reduced income volatility in most countries. So we have to remember this as well. And finally, we have to remember that policies targeting supply chains can lead to very significant economic losses, and in particularly for what the World Bank defines as low middle income countries, which are these countries with income per capita of $1,000 to $4,500, which is quite low. So to avoid economic fragmentation and preserve the benefits of global trade, it's an obvious statement. International cooperation in policy design is essential. However, I fear that the current trends suggest that the pendulum is swinging in the opposite direction, which means in the wrong direction. Thank you very much.
Elhanan, for a great talk and super insightful and yeah, wow. So we will have some time for questions from people in the audience. Let me start with your last point, Elhanan. So how do we stop this pendular swing? Is the increase in prices coming from the tariffs going to persuade people that this is a bad idea, or how does the story continue?
I don't know. Really political decisions. And we live in a world where in many countries, politicians have objectives which are not in line with achieving, economic gains, but rather other type of gains. So I don't know how this can be done. And we live now in a sort of setup where there's a lot of uncertainty how the international economy will evolve given the new administration in the US. Tariffs per se, depending on the size, of course, they are not such a terrible thing. But a lot of the volatility that has been introduced so far and uncertainty, this is pretty bad. And I don't know, it's possible that the stock market will fall even more, and there will be a recession in the US, and there will be a reconsideration, and maybe they'll decide to cooperate with other countries. But I'm somewhat doubtful about it. So I think we will live in a period which is very volatile, and I'm pessimistic. Things will get really bad. This is what I think, but I cannot prove it.
Please put up your hand and I'll come with a mic so that other people, yeah. And say your name and affiliation.
Okay, so I'm Jose Vasquez, assistant professor here at the management department. Thank you, Elhanan, for such an inspiring lecture. So one question about the rule-based international order, and specifically, I want to hear your opinion about the present and future of the WTO. Still, a lot of the world trade is still under WTO rules, but it might not mean that the WTO is doing something about it, and in particularly with the new swinging of the pendulum. Should the WTO do something, or should it be a passive actor? What do you think about the future of the WTO more generally?
Take two more questions and then you can, yeah, Martin.
Thank you very much. I wanted to ask you about bilateral trade deficits. I think there's this old quote from Solo saying that he had a big bilateral trade deficit with his barber, and there was no reason to care. But if you listen to Trump talking about trade policy, it's all about bilateral trade deficits. It used to be China, but now it's Mexico, it's Canada. So my question to you is whether there's any serious economic rationale that we can give for this, or whether it's just a misunderstanding.
Thank you. I'm Stephen, a master's student here at Public Policy Administration. So I think my question is, I don't know how much you agree that inflation in the US caused by the low-cost import from product from China, and which did not translate into increasing price in US domestic market during the past 20 years. So my question would be, how do you think the US, especially the new Trump administration, because it imposed tariffs, seems to all the US global trade partners. So how does the new government to solve the inflation problem at present? So, thank you.
Elhanan.
About the WTO, the situation is that the dispute settlement mechanism doesn't work. There are no judges to adjudicate complaints. So the WTO can do very little. It can, it can make statements that what countries do is wrong, but they cannot do much about it. Under the dispute settlement mechanism, if you were found guilty of imposing tariffs, for example, beyond your commitments, other countries could retaliate, third countries could affect, and so on. But all this mechanism is just dead now. It's not operating. So I don't know. I actually doubt that the Trump administration will appoint judges to the WTO. Biden didn't do it, and I doubt that Trump will do it. So the WTO is, at this point, I think, quite ineffective. So what we need eventually is to provide some mechanism that has teeth to operate in the future. There are all sorts of ideas about reforming the WTO to handle additional issues that have become more important now. Whether this will happen anytime soon, I doubt, but maybe eventually. I think the WTO played a very positive role for many years, and the GATT obviously as well. And now it's not a dead institution, but it doesn't have a bite anymore. So we'll wait and see. The bilateral trade deficit, I don't know about any studies that, I mean, you can reduce a bilateral trade deficit by killing trade between the two countries. You can do it. But this doesn't mean necessarily that you reduce your trade deficit, the overall trade deficit, because there are these, companies move across suppliers in different countries and so on. At the margin, it may have some effect, but at least in the Trump 2008 tariff, hasn't had much of an effect. Whether 25% in terms instead of 10% will have an effect, it will have somewhat bigger effect, I presume, but I don't know. I don't know about any studies which show that this will work on the overall trade deficit. Now, I'm not sure that I understood your question. Yeah. So you said that you think that China increased inflation in the US? Is this what you said at the beginning?
No, I'm sorry. Can I explain?
Yeah, go ahead.
Briefly, so that we have a second. Very good.
For sure. So I think because the inflation in the US is because of during the past years. So they import a low-cost product from China as a counter effect, which is the inflation in the US did not exist as a result of increasing prices in the US domestic market because they import this low-cost product from China. So that's my assumption. I don't know how much do you agree. So my question is, if now the new government impose new tariffs to its global trade partners, any like policy, advice or to solve this inflation issue for the U.S. Yeah.
I think Silvana can answer this question better.
So I think the effects on inflation from the first round of tariffs from the Biden administration was very small, mostly because it was, the overall share on imports, on total imports was, or the share of imports in total, in the total CPI basket is relatively small in the US, in the order of 10%. So even if you multiply that by the increase in tariffs, you get to a fairly small amount. And that's why Elhanan's effective tariff graph was not moving that much yet. But let's, we have a few more questions here. Let's start here, then Ben. Briefly, please.
Yes, thank you so much, Professor. I'm very skeptical about the actual technological spillover and the knowledge diffusion in the Southeast Asian countries right now, like Vietnam and Thailand. And do you think without a major trade partner like the US or China, will it still be possible for them to achieve the industrial upgrading by themselves, for example, through trade within blocks or intra-industry trades? Thank you.
Why are you skeptical about technological spillovers?
Yes, because I'm still feeling they're not gaining the actual technology. They just become labor intensive and they have more skilled workers, but they didn't actually achieve any innovative things.
Thanks very much for a great lecture. My question is about supply chain risk. I very much like your point that the businesses already factor in the supply chain risk themselves, and you want to think about what policy does relative to that. And I also like Silvana and Francesco's work on diversification through trade. But if you look at some real world supply chains, some of them seem remarkably undiversified somehow. So the one I've worked on a bit is Germany's dependence on Russian gas, where Germany imported more than half of its gas from Russia. And I guess the way one analogy I found useful is the analogy with like the banking sector of financial institutions, right? We also you could say the banks they should already factor in all the risks themselves, so we don't need to regulate them. But I mean we do regulate them, and there's similar stories you can tell about firms, right? Moral hazards problems where they think they would get bailed out, or they just underestimate these sort of systemic risks. So I guess I was just wondering, how you thought about that.
Excellent.
Thank you for the talk. Imagine you're the leader of a small open economy. Let's call it the UK, for example. What would you advise them to do, given that they're basically in the backseat and watching what the rest of the world is doing? How should they do their risk management? Not the firms, but the country as such. What would be your advice?
I think that there is a generic advice on this issue. The advice has to be contingent on the nature of the economy, and you have to sort of understand how the economy operates, what's its comparative advantage, various structures. So I wouldn't advise an economy that I don't know very well. And so I just don't have any generic advice on this issue. About the specific supply chains, the answer is yes. I mean, there are some, if you can study a particular supply chain, and if you understand its property, you can design policies for this particular supply chain. Again, there is no generic advice on how to handle these type of risks. My point was that a lot of the policy suggestions and implementation, actually, some of these policies, were done without studying, actually, the supply chains and without understanding how they operate and what are the issues involved. This was true under the Biden administration, and now I don't know exactly what what sort of this panel that Biden established in 2021. It had an interim report a year later, which, I mean, if you read the report, you wouldn't believe that economists wrote it. So, I mean, and now there are the national security issues. I think this is a delicate thing because there are obviously products which are important, and there probably is market failure in these products. So yes, governments can intervene and do something useful, but again, you have to sort of understand what the issues are, what the risks are, and what would be a good solution. I mean, you were lucky in some way when you studied the supply to Europe from Russia because you had estimates and they proved to be right. It's not always the case, right? But at least you had some estimates. You based your recommendation on the estimates. Now, I don't know any specific things about Thailand or some other countries that you have in mind, but the estimates of productivity spillovers across countries are very substantial. So the question is whether a particular country, whether it fits into these estimates or not. I don't know. One has to examine this particular country. But as a rule, the estimates of productivity gains through trade and knowledge flows are very large. And they are actually embodied in these losses that people estimated that I showed you. But there are many other estimates that showed how large these effects are. There is a very beautiful paper by, I'm so tired, I can't recover now names, by Ezra Oberfield, which have what I think are reasonably reliable estimates of this type of spillovers across a set of countries. And there are many other. They are not the only one. Okay.
Thank you very much, Elhanan. Elhanan, by the way, has already given another talk at the LSE this at noontime. So, I mean, I think it's time now for giving him a huge applause and a huge thank